So good evening and welcome. I'm Stephanie Rolfe. I am the Academic Director for the Shepherd Higher Education Consortium on Poverty. If you're not familiar with SHEP, we are an interinstitutional collaboration among 24 colleges and universities, all of whom support poverty studies programs in some form and who also share a summer internship experience in the summer. So tonight's event is really the kickoff event for that internship, which will begin on June 7th. And several of our, almost all, should I venture to say, of our 2021 interns are here with us tonight. So I want to extend a special welcome to them and encourage you to think of questions and think of ways that this event will kind of set the tone for you as we go into our 2021 program theme, which is practicing equity at the intersection of race and poverty. So this event tonight will kind of get us thinking in both a theoretical and a practical way about how to pull together the ideas of intersectionality, have a shared understanding of that, and also have that carry us into action and not just leave it in the theoretical space, which is the thing that I appreciate so much about Dr. Collins' book, Intersectionality in the second edition, which many of you are familiar with by now, is that it's not just about understanding the concepts, but it's really about putting that into practice. So for our 2021 interns, you'll hear me say this a lot over the next few months, and that is, it's not enough to just understand poverty. It is incumbent upon us to do something about it and to seek solutions that are equitable and that uphold all of our social justice values. And I hope that you are in the process of discovering those values for yourself and setting those priorities as you explore your work. So, as I said, we're beginning the 2021 program with this event tonight. And as I was preparing for this yesterday, I was thinking about where we were as an organization about this time last year. I think all of us have been seeing news coverage of that, right? A year ago today, we were just finding out this. For SHEP, as many of my colleagues who I can't see right now will remember, we were really scrambling, trying to figure out what we were going to do with an experience that had only ever been in person, taking place in cities across the country where the interns themselves were living with each other and experiencing this transformative event with each other and reflecting with each other and facing those challenges and learning curves together. And as we were going through that, we were sort of trying to figure out if this was something that could be done virtually. And eventually, of course, we did. And we all made those transitions, right? So anyone who's in higher education, our community partners who are on this call tonight, all of us were in that shared space. And so I want to recognize that we have a shared experience, all of us, that even though we may not know each other quite yet, or as well as we will over the next few months, we're bringing that with us into this summer in a way that's going to inform the way that we work, the way that we learn, and the way that we set challenges for ourselves in the future. And as we were going through that, we were thinking about and witnessing some of the most inspiring, challenging, and painful moments in many of our lifetimes regarding racial reckoning and the lack of it in this country. So the theme for this summer, practicing equity at the intersection of race and poverty, was deeply and directly informed by the experiences of last spring and last summer. And I thought it was important to recognize that tonight, that we're carrying those experiences with us into 2021. I'm a historian, and so history matters a whole lot to me. And I want to also point out that the events of last year were not anomalies. They were not new. They were not exaggerated. They were consistent with the history of this country and the history of its global connections over the course of time. And we need to make sure that we stay focused on that. And I think that what we saw last year was some tension between paying attention to the pandemic and also recognizing that there was a racial uprising that was demanding our attention and demanding our action. And thinking about this, I'm also, wanting to recognize that almost a year ago is when Ahmaud Arbery and his murder and the video that captured it made national news. And that really sort of became one of a series of things that really sort of defined us going forward. SHEP as an organization is committed to equity in the economic sphere, but also in all of the attached social justice issues that are connected to economic disparity and the hope for economic empowerment going forward. So we thought it was a good time for us to really zero in on this issue and to really kind of get around it a little bit. And there's no better way to do that than to talk about the concept of intersectionality. So I'm really, really excited to jump into this. And I know you did not sign up for me tonight. So let me just go ahead and shift into our introductions. Just a note about format, you are more than welcome to go ahead and start using that Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen. I am giving priority to the questions that were submitted ahead of time, and that's what you will see represented in the conversation between Dr. Evans and Dr. Collins. But we will have about 15 minutes to have some live back and forth in the Q&A. And Dr. Evans and Dr. Collins, what I will do is when we kind of bring this to a close at the time that we have agreed on, I will moderate those, and I welcome both of you to answer the questions as you see fit. So we'll make sure that both of you are involved in that conversation as the experts in the room. So, and as a reminder, we are recording this session. So if there are students, interns, community partners, colleagues of yours who were not able to join us during the live event, I will make sure to send a link out when that recorded, when the recorded version of it is ready to go. So it's my honor to get us started tonight by introducing our panelists. Patricia Hill Collins is Distinguished University Professor Emerita at the University of Maryland, College Park, and Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Africana Studies Emerita at the University of Cincinnati. She is the author of 10 books, among them her award-winning Black Feminist Thought and Black Sexual Politics, and numerous articles and essays. Professor Collins has taught at several institutions, held editorial positions with professional journals, lectured widely in the United States and internationally, and served in professional and community organizations. In 2008, she became the 100th president of the American Sociological Association and the first African-American woman elected to that position. Her recent books include Intersectionality as Critical Social Theory, and Intersectionality Second Edition, which was just published in 2020 and is the book that we sort of feature tonight, which she co-authored with Sirma Bilge. So welcome, Dr. Collins. We're looking forward to hearing from you. And it's always my pleasure to welcome my good friend and someone that I have so much admiration for, Louwanda Evans, who is Associate Professor of Sociology and Chair of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, and the current Director of African American Studies at Millsaps College, which is where I am broadcasting from tonight. And I can tell you that little blurb about Dr. Evans' work at Millsaps was just a teeny tiny bit of how significant she has been to the learning experience for so many of our students here. She is the co-author of Cabin Pressure, African American Pilots, Flight Attendants, and Emotional Labor. Her current research examines the relationships between systemic police brutality, youth, and collective trauma. Her second book, with Ruth Thompson Miller, is titled Please Don't Shoot: School Children, Police Violence, and Trauma, and is forthcoming with Routledge. Please join me in welcoming these distinguished scholars as our panelists. I am going to take my camera down and turn it over to the two of you.
Well, I'll start the conversation. First, let me start by saying thank you so very much, Dr. Collins, and all of you who are joining us tonight. I want to thank our community partners. I want to or thank our member institutions, our students, our interns, and our colleagues. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm so excited for this conversation on intersectionality. And so, what we're going to do is really kind of dive into some of the questions that you've sent over, and I want to acknowledge those, and then have Dr. Collins kind of respond, and then we'll have a conversation as necessary. I do want to give Dr. Collins as much space as possible to get into these things. And so I'm going to just sort of jump right in if that's okay. So let's talk about this notion of intersectionality. So, Dr. Collins, if we can start, can you tell us a bit about what this is from a definition perspective?
See, this is always a difficult question. So you sent me the hardest question first, because I could say intersectionality is a framework of analyzing the world, moving through the world that takes into consideration intersecting systems of power. I could say that. I could say intersectionality has various dimensions. It has the dimension of social structure, it has the dimension of culture, it has the dimension of um, interpersonal relationships. I could say that too. But I think the best way to get into intersectionality definitionally is to hear a story about it, is to look at how people use intersectionality. And I'll just tell you a quick story of my own. I was very interested when I was younger in race and racism. That's where I started working. That's where I was interested in social justice work. And I had a racial frame on what was happening to Black people in this country. But as I matured and as I studied, I know many of you out there tonight are students, as I studied and I really had to think about race and racism more broadly, I realized that it wasn't enough. So I began to look at the intersections of race and gender and how they affect the lives of Black men and Black women. I was still working within race, but I was putting gender within race, trying to solve social problems of social injustice as it affected Black people. But then as I kept going, I discovered that that was not enough either, that I had to pay attention to the class system in the United States, which is difficult to see because we think of class through racial language in the US. So there I was trying to pull together race and gender and class and how they affected, by this time in my life, what I was really focused on. The social problem, the social issue that I was interested in was what constitutes a quality education for Black youth. I was interested in Black youth. I was interested in education. I was interested in social justice because I didn't see how you could get a quality education without social justice. So by the time I clarified my question, I said, the question that I have and the problem that I'm trying to address cannot be addressed solely within a racial framework or a gender framework or a class framework or a sexuality framework or any one of these particular frameworks. The kind of question that I asked around social justice for Black youth required multiple frameworks and it required multiple strategies because it was a complex question. It seemed simple, but it was complex and it required complex analyses. Now, during the same period of time, there were many other people working in different locations. Some of them were Latina, some of them were indigenous, some were poor white folks, some were Asian folk, some were immigrant folk, some were LGBTQ folk who were grappling with similar questions of social justice. But they didn't have a way, we didn't have a way to talk to one another. We had no common language because we were talking within the framework of race only, or gender only, or class only. And we developed specialized analyses and we developed specialized politics in those locations. But as the world changed and we were able to see one another more closely, we began to meet in something that I'd call a crossroads, a space of intersection, where you actually see ideas and policies and programs meeting together. People who came together who said, You know, I can't solve my social issue without your insight and without your politics, but you're so different than me. How are we going to work this out? That's the moment that we're in now in a lot of ways. As intersectionality unfolds, we can now see much more clearly intersecting systems of power. We can see how power works because we're not just looking at one form of power. We can see more clearly political programs that are intersectional, but more to the point, we have stronger conceptual tools for analyzing social problems. Now, one thing that very much interested me about tonight's meeting is applying the tools of intersectionality to the social problem of poverty. I don't honestly see how we can talk about poverty in ways that are anything but intersectional. There is no way that a class analysis which says the problem with poverty is just class, that ignores racism, that ignores how poverty affects women and men differently, that ignores how poverty is experienced differently by Black people and Latinas and immigrants, that ignores age in terms of poverty. Poverty is children, back to my issue earlier on, child poverty, or all of those various categories, how they contribute to poverty. There is no generic human who is poor. The people who are poor are, in fact, actual people who are situated in these particular relationships. So in our book, Sirma Bilge and our book, we have so much there. But one thing we do not focus on is applying this intersectional framework to the idea of poverty in ways that do not push away the richness of what is coming from multiple points of view on poverty. So that's what interests me about tonight's conversation. And I'll just stop there for a minute to see if you want to follow up or ask me to emphasize something a little more, or however you want to go with this. Yes.
Oh, I do, of course. So it's really interesting to me, a couple of things that you mentioned, and it's sort of two-dimensional. One, you mentioned the word power.
Yes.
And not supremacy or other words that you could have used. You used the word power, and I think that's really interesting. I would like for you to expand that if you can, briefly. And then two, really when we think about this notion of poverty and intersectionality, and you mentioned that it's not a generic person, but people,
Yes.
that there are people that live here. I want you to think about notions of equity and justice and power, as you mentioned, in terms of poverty and action, if that makes sense. Like, how can we sort of move? So, two very different questions.
They are.
But two big follow-ups.
So let's start with the first big follow-up, because I think the second big follow-up is tied to questions that other people have already asked.
Yes.
But this first issue of thinking about power, because we live in a country that wants to tell us power doesn't exist or power is not important. We as individuals can make our own future without any help. And if we're failing or if we're having problems, it's all on us. All right. As opposed to looking at social structures and the way that they support various systems of power. So I would talk about white supremacy as a system of power. I tend to use the term structural racism as a system of power, and white supremacy as the ideology that actually shapes it. I talk about patriarchy as a system of power that affects women, or heteropatriarchy as a system of power that affects women and sexual groups as well, but that we can have misogyny or women hating as part of the homophobia as ideologies that uphold those systems of power. So when I look at the question of power, I'm looking at hierarchy. I'm not looking at being marginalized and all of that. I'm not looking at, I'm in the center of power and you're in the margins. That's a flat model of power that is useful for certain types of questions. I'm looking at old-fashioned oppression, which is hierarchical, which says there are people at the top, there are people at the bottom, and there are lots of people in the middle, maybe, right? And that if we lose the ability to see power hierarchies, we lose the ability to see political domination, and we lose the ability to conceive of political domination in terms of how we resist it, because we're actually misdiagnosing it, not as power at all or as domination at all. In fact, we can misdiagnose it as just bad ideas. And what you want to do is fix people who have bad ideas about Black people or women or whatever. So my work is profoundly structural. It is sociological. It says that when I think about structures of power, I'm not just thinking about how they manifest themselves. I'm thinking about them as domination. I don't know how to say it any other way. So there's so many parts to this whole question. Now, in the intersectionality book, what we do in the first chapter is we introduce intersectionality through domains of power. And we say that there are ways of cutting into this kind of big category of power that tell you how it's organized, regardless of what kind you're talking about. There are going to be structural dimensions of power. Those are the social institutions like churches and banks and the government. I live on a busy street, if you hear the siren, just so you know. Right? Just ignore that, I'm used to it. But those structural institutions are the ones that set the policies and procedures that we're supposed to follow. That's the law. That's what those structural institutions do. Schools, the school you went to is very significant in where you're going to end up in life. The neighborhood you live in, all of that. There's also the area of we call it the hegemonic or the cultural domain of power. We don't think of ideas as just being, incidental. We say power works through ideas. Power works through pictures. Power works through YouTube. Power works through all the things that shape the world that we're in of ideas. We also talk about disciplinary power. And this is a form of power to make people go to their assigned places. We discipline you. You got out of place, you can wrap your knuckles, or I can find other ways. When we look at some of the police violence that we've seen in this country, the kinds of needless deaths of young Black folk, this is very much disciplinary power. It, of course, is coming from the institutional power of the government and police, but the actual behaviors that killed George Floyd is clearly disciplinary power. It's meant to discipline him and everybody that's looking at him. Do not get out of place. And that affects that last domain of power, interpersonal relationships among us. We always have the opportunity to become an instrument of power, an enforcer, because we're afraid, or we can become people who use that space of the kinds of relationships we have among us as spaces of liberation and freedom. We don't have to choose to be who people want us to be. So when I look at intersectionality takes that model and it makes it more complex. It says you can take that model and talk about racial power only, and that's important to do. But there are limits to how far your analysis will get you if you really want to have the kinds of behaviors and solutions to these problems that are needed. For example, violence. How on earth do we solve the problem of violence by picking one form of violence or the violence against one group and saying, we're just going to look at that? We're going to have to look at racial violence, gender violence, the violence of the state around militarism. We're going to have to look at a variety of things. We're going to have to look at interpersonal violence, the things that people don't want to talk about that happens in their homes, but that people take from their homes out into the streets. There's so many things going on there. So intersectionality is a set of conceptual tools that allow those of us who have been thinking about very similar things from very different places to recognize each other's wisdom and to begin to learn from one another the solutions that might work. Because this is the next big question you were going to ask. Where do you go with solutions? If you have a bad diagnosis of the problem, you're going to have flawed solutions. right? If you have theories that define the world in such a way that it cannot be changed, we have a lot of social theories like that these days. They're very good at telling you about how oppressed you are, but then they don't know what to say about what to do. If you look at the book that we wrote, Intersectionality, we ground it in the actions of people who are taking on all of these multiple forms of power in many different ways. So we can enter into that discussion, but I want to emphasize
Collins,
that.
I'm hearing all the sirens in your background. I thought it
I
was.
don't know what's happening today. Something must be burning down the block.
Well, I'm in Jackson, Mississippi, so I thought it was me, and then you said it's you.
No, I'm used to it.
Oh.
But I mean, it's really, I don't know what, they're giving away free money down the street. Maybe that's it.
No problem. But you know what? I have a question from student Emily Wells that your response kind of tied into this a little bit. So Emily Wells is a student at VMI, and she asked what you think about the intersections or connections between culture and poverty. And so, I will say from my perspective, I'm not sure what culture means here. Maybe you have a better idea, but what would you think about the connections between or the intersections of culture and poverty?
Well, I think there are lots of ways of looking at culture and poverty. I mean, many people don't even see poverty.
Right.
I mean, is poverty something that's just numbers? You know, one day you're poor and then you made $5 extra and now you're no longer poor. I mean, are we going to go with those kinds of definitions of poverty, or the ways in which in the US poor people are actually invisible? All right, so there may be a lot of poverty, but nobody believes it because you never see it, right? Even in big cities, when people are sleeping on the streets, we learn not to see those people anymore, as opposed to when they began to sleep on the streets, and it was so shocking to me to see so many homeless people in the US. So poverty has fallen off the public debate. I mean, there has not been much discussion of poverty per se as a social problem, but that doesn't mean it went away just because we don't use that term. So that's one piece of it. The other piece with culture, I will say this first about culture and poverty. There's an argument called the culture of poverty argument that I'm going to assume that this particular student is rejecting, because it's an argument that says the reason people are poor is because they have a bad culture. Now, this is an argument that is often applied to people of color. Very different groups have sort of faced this. The notion that there is good culture, which is middle-class, white, elite culture, where there are values of hard work, industriousness, raising your family, being married. There's a whole list of things that go along with good culture in the US context. And surprisingly, they seem to match up with racial privilege, class privilege, gender privilege, sexual privilege, such that the people who have the good culture seem to kind of hit the jackpot in systems of privilege that intersect or converge to their advantage. Whereas people who are on the bottom with these bad cultures are the ones who are doing things wrong, and the explanation is their culture. For example, this is one we've been battling for quite some time in sociology. It has to do with Black women, because the assumption is that those in a culture who are responsible, I do not know what's going on. All right, those in a culture who are responsible for culture, and that's often women, are the ones who are causing the poverty. This is something you hear often, that, oh my goodness, if those Black women would just behave like all the other women, maybe they wouldn't be so poor. Now, this is a fascinating argument for someone to say to you, you can marry your way out of poverty by marrying someone who's just as poor as you. This makes no sense, all right? But the cultural arguments do have some legs when it comes to cultures of opposition. So what I study are connections between Black women who say, look, we don't glorify poverty. We don't want to be poor. We want opportunities. We want resources. We want a future for our children. And we are going to get together and develop cultural practices that will foster our collective empowerment. So there are all kinds of cultures of opposition out there as well. This is why if you say culture is inherently a bad argument or inherently a good argument, you miss the texture of how culture operates. Now, there's one more piece with culture. We are no longer talking about cultures that are self-contained and grounded in neighborhoods of people where you know everybody. And that's where culture is made and culture is consumed. It's not like we're going to the party down the block and we're all singing and dancing on Friday night. We live in a very powerful global media culture environment where ideas now circulate quickly, both good and bad, and where the cultural sphere is producing many ideas for us that we have to think about how to use in politics. And intersectionality really influences what we see, what we don't see, and it's very important in how we evaluate the shows that we're going to get, the music videos that are out there, the lyrics that are there, and what that all means and how that can be used. So these are wonderful times around thinking about all the tools that are available if you are doing social justice work. You can think about social justice work in structures. You can think about social justice work in the cultural sphere. You can think about social justice work in communities in terms of grassroots activism. And using the tools of intersectionality will allow anyone who's involved in social justice work to see the connections between what you're doing and what other people are doing, all right? And to open the conversation so it's much broader and we can learn from each other's projects. So the culture and poverty connection is a complicated one, but I would encourage the student to think more broadly about each of those categories and then to come back and think about their connections.
Dr. Collins, thank you for that. You know, when you were speaking earlier about, poverty causes and blame, I really thought about your work on controlling images.
Yes.
And how that kind of plays into that. I don't know if we'll have time to come back to it. I think it's important to think about, especially for our students in terms of how we conceptualize poverty, the feminization of poverty, and then the Black feminization of poverty, if we can think about it in those particular ways. But there are a couple of questions that we have from Grant Yancey at Millsaps, and then we also have one from Sierra Minton at Berea, as well as Lillian Patterson, that I want to sort of tie in together because they sort of fit together. And that is about action. So we have this understanding of intersectionality, but then what do we do with it? How do we move forward in terms of action? So that's one big question. Now, I do have another big question that I would like to ask from Anusha at Hamilton. And she's saying that according to Barbara Foley, intersectional approaches, they don't offer an adequate explanatory framework for addressing the root causes of social inequality to the capitalist socioeconomic system. So she's asking, how does intersectionality pose a barrier when someone asks questions about the root causes of inequality?
Well, let me start with that since you asked it second. First of all, to me, there is no root cause of inequality. Okay. All right, what would that be? You find the root cause, and then once you find the root cause, you then do what? You diagnose the problem in such a way that it is very difficult to solve. So if the root cause of inequality is what? Culture? Is the root cause of inequality or the root cause of poverty, for example? We can work with something a little more, kind of tighter. Is it ability? Is that the root cause of inequality, that actually people are just very different from one another and they get their just desserts because that's what causes inequality? And therefore inequality is in fact socially just. It's not that it's wrong. I mean, it actually is getting things right, that you've got Black people on the bottom and women underpaid, and that's inequality, but it's actually not a problem because it's caused. The root cause is the human. Or is the root cause of inequality capitalism? Well, you know what? There was a lot of inequality before capitalism. So are we talking about special kinds of capitalism? Poverty is a really good example. Poverty is ancient. It didn't begin with capitalism. It took on certain different forms when capitalist systems were put into place. But it's not like it sort of sprang from nowhere. But what capitalism does get you to look at are places where you did not see poverty. What were existing ways of living that were where people simply were not poor? People lived differently. And we're back to what exactly is poverty under capitalism? So it does offer insight, but what happens with the class only argument is those of us who do not want to buy into or see the limits of Marxist social theory are not happy with a social theory that says to us, class analysis is really what you all should be doing. And racism is an add-on to capitalism. And sexism is a derivative of capitalism. And if you really got involved in class politics, then that would be the solution. But you might have to wait, because a lot of the people who see themselves as involved in class politics happen to be working class white men working certain types of jobs. So it's sort of, everybody has a piece of the puzzle. And my issue with that particular argument is that's a really important piece. I mean, that Marxist social theory is really an important piece, but it's not the whole piece. And this is the nature of the root cause of everything. I will argue just as vehemently with my Black colleagues who say, the biggest problem in the world is racist white people. They can't help themselves. That's the way they are. They want to argue it as something fundamental to human nature of racist white people or to human nature. They say people are just naturally violent. So we just have to live with that. So there are all kinds of theories of root causes of social inequality. And this is one reason I'm sort of trying to hammer on this, because I think backing off from that and saying, what is intersectionality trying to do? It is not a theory that's trying to analyze the root causes of social inequality. So she's holding it to a standard of something that it's not trying to do. Right? So then the issue is, well, what is it trying to do? Intersectionality is trying to help people who are in the middle of solving social problems that affect their everyday lives to do that. And to do that by giving them tools that are both analytical and that are also political. Not just one without the other. The knowing and the doing go together. So in many ways, intersectionality is a theory, is the other book I wrote. It's theoretical, but you can think of it more as a method of doing intellectual work and political work that enhances what you're doing. You get better at it because your arguments get better and your strategies get better because you're looking at things through a more complex lens than a monocategorical lens. Now, that's the second question. Back to the first question, which was, refresh me.
What can we do? So many of our students would like to know, like they're going to go out and do these internships with our community partners. They're going to do these internships with folks in the community, and they want to know how they can use this intersectional approach moving forward. So what would be some sort of advice that you'd give?
The advice that I would give is you can't take an intersectional approach and then take it with you and then apply it. It's not that kind of theory. It's not that kind of framework. It's something that develops as you try to use it to the best of your ability. And the best way to do that is to start with a social problem you want to solve. It doesn't start with intersectionality. It starts with the problem in front of you. What is it that you want to accomplish? And in my case, having to commit to something for my entire life. That may seem like a little much if you're a student starting out, but let's say you really go into this internship and you realize the information that you're learning about poverty is something that you say, I'm going to commit to doing something about this. So now I need some tools to help me do that. Am I the kind of person, first of all, I'll start without the intersectionality. I'll start with power. If I see the problem as being poverty, am I the kind of person that gravitates to institutions of power because I want to be a policymaker that will allow me to go into government settings, corporate settings, and make some changes based on the power that I can accrue because I have a degree. I believe in degrees, by the way, that everybody, I mean, I will just repeat that, going to school and getting a degree, all right? That's what I'm going to do with my degree, even though that may not be my actual field. Or are you an artist? Are you the kind of person who really can influence people through your poetry, through your dance, through your film? You know, are you the one that's going to make that creative work that can reach kids, that can reach people where they are? You're not particularly interested in sharing the policy environment, but what you are interested in doing is changing people's views. Or are you the kind of person who's going to be the watchdog over how things are run? You're going to be the person who's in a grassroots setting, who's going to say every time there is a violation that the police, for whatever reasons, do, I will be the one who's there to record it, lead it, and complain about it, all right? Or are you saying, you know, when it comes to poverty, the best thing that I can do is not be poor myself? And there are a lot of people like that too, all right? That doesn't mean I have to hoard, but when it comes to poverty, perhaps what I want to do is be comfortable so I can give to philanthropic organizations. Now, those are all very different strategies for solving poverty that may match up with who you are as a person. But I think the issue for intersectionality is to say, start with how you analyze the problem and then continue to massage your own analyses and actions. Let me give you should I give you a personal experience? Do we have enough time? Okay.
And I think this is like a great point to sort of bring up. So yes, please do share with us.
Yeah, all right. So let me just share this because it's a moment of I think it's important for students to know that self-reflection is really important. All right, so I'm dedicated to working about anti-racism. I am dedicated to poverty. I think I've got all the answers. I see social justice. I move to a new city. I go to a park. I have my 4-year-old daughter. She's about 4 at this point, maybe 3 or 4. Now she's a grown woman, but then she was a little one. And we go to the public park. And we're in the public park and she's running around having fun. And next to us, there's a family that has children in it. It's a white family. And there's a child who's playing. And this child clearly was from a family that did not have resources. This is the first time I actually saw white poverty. Now, until I got to that park, I thought in my mind, all the poverty that I'd seen was Black people. And I could really put forth a very powerful argument about the historic forces that had created poverty in Black communities. And it's a very good argument. But I had to really say, at what point when I first thought was, well, I'm glad they're not Black because that would look bad. I thought, wait a minute, at what point did I lose empathy for poverty among white children, for a white child, because of how I was thinking about the world? My lens was incomplete. My lens was a racial lens and it was a partial class lens, but I needed a much more robust class lens to get a race-class intersectional analysis of poverty. And when I started thinking about the poor people I had seen or not seen, many of them were men. So even though I'm very much, I would claim feminism, I've never been anti-men, but I hadn't really thought about poor men who were not Black men. So the whole notion of beginning to think about class relations and race relations together, that's the intersectional framework, and challenging my own thinking about that intersection. So to me, you do intersectional work not by going out and trying to put all the categories to work at once, but you put it to work by looking at what you're trying to think about and do, and realize how intersectionality can help you or not in what it is you're trying to do. The intersection you may need to see that you don't consider may be the one that person needs, right? If you're looking at a woman and you're thinking of everything through the frame of race and class, she's a poor Black woman. You say, oh my gosh, you're a poor Black woman. But maybe the woman issue is the important lens that you should be looking at, not just the race and class and the extra kind of woman is added in, it's just sort of a trifle. It may be that she is confronting situations of violence that are quite significant in her ability to not be poor, or perhaps reproductive decisions are a challenge, or health decisions. So when you start looking at those together, you get a much more robust understanding of the problem and the people, not just people as problems, but the problems and the people in front of you. This is how intersectionality works, rather than what it is as kind of a dead thing that we just put in our book bag and carry to the next place. So without you in the middle of doing the intersectional work, it's not intersectional work, it's just a bunch of ideas. I would suggest that students commit to something in the same way that you pick out a major. You spend your whole, you spend all your time as an undergrad thinking, what shall I major in? And then my major will take me into my job and into my this. Why not major in a social justice issue that you take with you wherever you go? Whatever setting you find yourself in, you are still majoring in social justice and you're attempting to improve. So intersectionality to me provides that language for people who are doing or thinking about the world that way.
I appreciate so much about what you've said. And I know that I'm going to open it up to Dr. Rolfe here in just a second, but I do like the fact that we're sort of closing out with this notion of our lens and how we view the world.
Yes.
And despite what we do, we can still do something at the end of the day. And I also love the fact that despite what we do, we can still focus on social justice. You don't have to be a sociology major, a psychology, or you can do so many things, but you can still have that lens and that sort of focus on those particular issues. I think that's what our interns need to sort of hear. So Dr. Rolfe, I'm gonna, I know that we have some questions, I believe. I think we have a good bit. I'm gonna open it up to you if you'd like, so that you can ask those questions and we can go from there.
Yes, I'm not going to turn my video on because I want to keep y'all front and center. So this is a very judicious decision, okay? There's so many good questions here, so many good questions that have been submitted. So for those of you who submitted, I'm basically trying to get at some issues that haven't been covered in some way. So please do not take offense or see that as a slight in any way, that the question is not good. These are all vibrant questions that we could spend a whole hour on each of them. But I'm trying to get at some of the things that haven't been covered exactly yet. So we have a question here that I think does, sort of is circulating for us as SHEP and for some of our SHEP schools. And that is to each of you, how do you feel about the language of poverty studies courses? So poverty studies in quotes and programs, given the emphasis really needs to be placed on hierarchy and power as well. Do we need a language change? And what might that look like?
Well, I don't know exactly the situation that you're talking about, but I'm not one that goes for a quick language change. I think the issue is to deepen the language you're already using to make sure that power analysis is included, or at least it's challenged by thinking about that. So, because poverty is a useful word. I mean, I don't give up a word while it still is useful. The issue is, how are you using it?
So, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I don't have a full answer. I agree that we don't need to be quick to change language, but because I'm in Jackson, Mississippi, and it's 80% Black, high poverty levels, and I work at a white institution. And so I do feel a jolt of concern when we work with the community and my students say it's a poverty class. And and they're largely dealing with Black folks.
So you're talking about white students dealing with Black folks. That's based and thinking about their. So it's like a hyper visibility of Black poverty.
It
So
is.
that's how they think about it.
It is. And I also think about what that feels like from the Black perspective, being, you know, a poor person at one point in my life. Like if there were some white kids there saying, oh, I'm in a poverty class and I'm working with you, then you are indeed poor. It challenges me in a way that I'm trying to think through that.
No,
And
it sounds like a colonial relationship. Would you say that that's what it is? Like a colonial relationship? You got sort of the missionaries, and then you got the natives. If you sort of took it out of the Jackson, Mississippi, you know, in terms of I'm one of the natives and I'm the poor ones and I'm one of the missionaries to save you, or some framework like that.
so to me, it feels, and that's just personal. And so I've been grappling with that at Millsaps. I don't want it to be called poverty studies.
Okay.
Because it's, you know, it's just me though. It's this funny sort of thing and this funny.
Well, no. As you talk about it, that gives me a better sense of, because, you know, a lot of people use the word poverty in many different situations differently, right? Now, if calling it poverty studies gets cachet with money and resources and those outside of Jackson, Mississippi, then that's one reason to use the language in a certain way in those settings. But then to think about how to surround that language with other frameworks, right? So if you were to, I don't know if intersectionality would be one to do that, but to ask how you would talk about power, it's like, what do you want to accomplish? What do you really want to accomplish? I mean, what does the program want to accomplish? And then how do you set it up so it does that, right?
I completely agree.
Well, okay, I'm going to have to come to Jackson, Mississippi one day. I just want to let you know that. I mean,
We'll have
Please
to
do. We would
I
love
would
to have
happily
you.
come to Jackson, Mississippi.
Yes.
I've only been to Mississippi once, and it was just a terrific visit. It was one of those eye-opening, I loved it kinds of visits. So, yeah, so okay. Alrighty, but that's an aside, even though we're sort of veering off track here. Is there another question?
Yes, yes, of course. Cameron Godsey from Washington and Lee has asked a question about the role of age in intersectionality. And what she's asking is, when discussing intersectionality, how would you address people who are struggling to identify their own privilege within intersectionality? And if age is a part of intersectionality, can you go into more depth about how it plays a different role for each person with, you know, all of these other layers in there?
Let me just say a little bit about that, because that's what I'm working on right now. So I love this question, right? Because part of my own journey through intersectionality is to, as I said, start with race, and then it was race and gender, and then race, gender, class, which meant I had to come back and look at race again. And then I looked at, you know, sexuality. And what the issue with each of these systems is they are not equivalent. Each of these systems of power, you can't just pull one out and plop the other one in. They have their own way of being organized. And this was the earlier question about class organization under capitalism, is very different than talking about racism, is very different than talking about gender discrimination. Now, age is really interesting because it's not a system that is given to you, like race is given to you by the state. That's how you know you're black and white and all that. The government comes and says that. Or it's not something that is biologically based, that you have to struggle with what the boundaries are. Gender fits in that category much more so, particularly people who are born in one biological gender and change. And sexuality is also biologically based to a certain extent. Now, age has this curious thing of being both biological, but also changing. You can actually be vulnerable when you're younger, when children, I've talked a lot about children tonight. You can age out of certain practices that you're vulnerable to when you're young. For example, Black men very often and Black women age out of violence because they're not considered young and threatening in the same way. And then you can enter into a phase of life that is one of dependency, or independence. So the whole life course literature is really interesting in terms of how age may be working in conjunction with power. That's the question I think that is being asked here. So I think age is definitely an axis of power within intersectionality. But I think as I look at the other forms of power that we're trying to think about how they intersect and work together, age is one we're going to have to be careful with in terms of what age are we talking about. Because we tend to look at older people, younger people, and then in the middle are the normally aged people called the adults, right? And how to really think about that in terms of systems of power is, there's some interesting stuff to think about there as well, which I can say more about, but I will not in the interest of time. But I'm just going to say that is a terrific question, and please stay with that one.
Absolutely, I agree.
I'm going to share one more question, and then we're going to bring this to a close. I'm conscious of everyone's time, especially our panelists. I encourage our students and everyone who has submitted questions to think about how we can bring this into our conversation going forward for the next few months that we'll be together. These are vibrant questions, they're persistent questions, and they're ones that need to be revisited. So please just bookmark this for future times where we'll be together for discussion. So the final question that I think is really pertinent here is from Taylor Jones, who's asking, can democracy and neoliberalism resolve the crises of racism and poverty in America?
No. I'm sorry, Taylor. I just don't think so. But what I do think is that what we have to fight for is participatory democracy.
Yeah.
I really think that, I mean, neoliberalism is the system that fundamentally says, go for yourself as individuals. Market solutions, there are market solutions to all of these problems. Racism will fix itself if you let the market do it. So, you know, we have that already, and we know that doesn't work, and we also know what that doesn't lead to. Participatory democracy, in some ways, is the political arm of intersectionality. Intersectionality is talking about participatory democracy in how it wants to form its knowledge and how it wants to function. So we have a living experiment of participatory democracy in, I don't even use the term democracy anymore because people like layer all kinds of things on that. I am very clear to say participatory democracy means full participation of the talents and the energies of the people who are here. Full participation means that you take care of people who need help. You do not leave them starving in the street. You certainly don't expect 4-year-olds to go to work because you say people are poor because they don't want to work. You know, there's certain things that are just crazy and wacky around the neoliberal framework if you really take a step back and say, this makes no sense. So it's really, what kind of world do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a world that is a community of vanilla or just chocolate or whatever? Do you want to live in a world that is really very rich, interesting people, great ideas? You got people with red hair and people with no hair. You know, you have the whole thing going on, and they participate. They contribute to the best of their abilities to that bigger experiment. This is an experiment that we're living with. A participatory democracy that has everybody from the rest of the world in it. Now, if that's not the big experiment for democracy, I don't know what is. So what is going on now in this country of ours that has so much amazing talent? I have traveled, and I am telling you, they're fabulous people in this country. We deserve better from our governments on all levels to help us participate to the best of our ability and to take care of us when we cannot. And there are many people who cannot for a variety of reasons until they can. So, yeah, so that's why I just said no. Participatory democracy is not something that's going to happen if we just sit around waiting for it to happen, or if we just wish it into being. Oh, I wish we had some more of that participatory democracy. No, this is not something I am going to see in my lifetime or your lifetime fully realized, because there's so many people who have to be brought along to participate. And there's so many people who have to be challenged as to why they are so afraid of having other people participate. All of that has to happen. That's the moment where we are now. But I tend to look back to the age question. I tend to look at those of you who are the interns, who I'm going to assume are sort of on the young side, but if you're not, that's okay too, all right? But I tend to look at the next generation of leadership that's going to come from an internship program, or it's going to come from those of you who are freshmen or sophomore in college, or a returning student who's decided this is your opportunity to finally go to school, because you are the leaders of the future of participatory democracy. So to me, my little piece that I'm contributing is giving you one book that you're probably going, oh, why do we have to read this book? But come back to it when you need to, when you can. It will read differently after you've worked on those problems, or that problem that you decide you are not going to let go. I don't know what that's going to be for you, because there's such a range of things. And then you keep deepening your analysis and you say, I'm getting it now. It's coming clearer to me. So, but definitely no on neoliberalism. And let's give participatory democracy a chance, because the alternatives are very, very scary. And we know what the alternatives are. We don't have to imagine them.
I'm with you. I have nothing to add. Very well said. Yeah.
Incredibly relevant for the moment that we're in right now, and all of the various pieces of legislation that are in process right now, and legislation that's been passed to narrow our participation in democracy. So
Absolutely.
thank you, Dr. Collins, for that.
Well,
Dr.
thank
Evans?
Taylor for that question, because if she hadn't asked it, I don't think I would have gotten so fired up. I like the way she asked it. Or he? Is Taylor a he or she?
And to you, Taylor, thank you for that.
He.
Dr. Evans and Dr. Collins, I think that you're leaving everybody hungry for more tonight. I think that a lot of brains are spinning right now, mine included. I'm sorry that we have to close, but gosh, what a great way to think about how we move forward and the questions that we need to keep asking. If you haven't already ordered Intersectionality, please, please, please do so. To reiterate what Dr. Collins just shared, the work that you are about to enter, and for our partners who are on the call tonight as well, the work that you do day in and day out, especially over the past 12 months where circumstances have become more complicated, that book is going to give you a lot of really informed insight about your experience, and it is a dynamic process of moving that furniture around in your head and figuring out, as Dr. Collins said, where are you in this?
Yes.
You know, what is your perspective? Where is your passion? And those are questions we will worry you to death about this summer, because we want you doing the work. We want you to use this internship as a way into lifelong commitment to social justice and to alleviating poverty specifically. So please keep that in mind. If you haven't ordered it, we have a SHEP discount until April 15th. And I do want to give a plug here to our next event, which is going to be in June, but is related to a lot of what we have talked about tonight. So I'm just going to share a slide for that. I hope everybody has a great evening tonight. And Dr. Collins, thank you so much for your time and for your conversation and your candidness and the challenge that you have extended to us. Dr. Evans, of course, thank you for your continued contributions to SHEP and for participating and leading us in this discussion. To our interns, please continue to think through these questions and share with us what your thoughts are. We're relying on you to kind of keep us sharp. So have a good night, and we will see everybody on the other side.
Thank you all.
Thank you.